2016 report on agriculture released. Merger and acquisition trend in Vietnam in wider economic boundaries. Hello and welcome to this edition of BizLine brought to you by VTV International. You're with me, Lina Pham. And as usual, we'll start our program by reviewing the economic highlights over the past week. The World Bank and the Institute of Policy and Strategy for Agricultural and Rural Development released the 2016 Vietnam Agricultural Report at a conference on Tuesday. Vietnam rose above the poverty line in 2010, marking an important milestone for the agricultural sector. The next phase of development is structural reform for sustainable development. The report shows that it's not necessary for Vietnam to produce in excess 30% of its rice to ensure food security. The country should also consider exporting less raw rice and instead focus on making products from rice to increase net value. In the next 15 to 20 years, the agriculture sector will need to contribute about a fifth of GDP and create jobs for 25 to 30% of the workforce. The Ministry of Industry and Trade has allowed Sabeco to be listed on the Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange. Consultants will set the share price, but demand will dictate the final sale. The initial public offering is likely to happen within the next 3 months. Meanwhile, the State Capital Investment Corporation, or SCIC, has announced plans to sell a 9% stake in Vinamilk by the end of this year. The government has an approximate $4 billion holding in state-owned firms, accounting for 90% of total capital in 10 state-owned enterprises. SCIC has sought consultancy this September to set prices and will finish the divestment process by November. In related news, Shrivada Nabadi, Thailand's second richest billionaire, wants to buy Vinamilk. The billionaire is the owner of Thai Bev, the owner of Chang beer brand in Thailand, and Fraser & Neave, a drinks manufacturer in Singapore. With the purchase of F&N, Vinamilk shares owned by the Singaporean beverage company have fallen into the hands of the Thai billionaire. The Thai billionaire has an ambitious plan to leverage Vinamilk's distribution network to expand his beverage empire. According to the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development's Plant Protection Department, China's General Department of Quality Supervision, Inspection and Quarantine has granted qualifications for 8 Vietnamese companies for sterilization of exported rice. Earlier, to ensure the safety of imported rice from Vietnam into China and prevent intrusion of harmful organisms, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development and China's General Department of Quality Supervision, Inspection and Quarantine signed a protocol on May the 30th. The recognition of 8 Vietnamese companies is considered a major step in the implementation of the protocol, which has allowed Vietnam to closely monitor rice processing and to assert competitiveness in quality and price on the market. Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc has approved a master plan for the development of Lào Cai Province Sapa National Tourism Area until 2030, with the goal of developing high-quality tourism products and attracting about 5.2 million visitor arrivals. Accordingly, the Sapa National Tourism Area covers the entire Sapa district, including a 1,500-hectare core region focusing on tourism development. Under the master plan, Sapa will meet new criteria to become a recognized national tourism area by 2020 and will become an international level resort and cultural tourism center by 2030. It is predicted that Sapa will compete strongly against other countries' tourism hubs. Intel Vietnam, a subsidiary of the world's largest microchip maker, has denied rumors that it would close its office, but confirmed that a downsizing is coming. Refuting the shutdown claims, Intel Vietnam has said it will continue doing business in the country, but with fewer staff. Intel Vietnam will reduce its number of employees by 2/3. This is part of Intel's global strategy to cut off 12,000 jobs globally, or 11% of its workforce, as it focuses its business towards making microchips that power data centers and internet-connected devices, and away from the declining personal computer industry. We have just reviewed some of the economic highlights over the past week. Up next, we'll talk about the merger and acquisition prospect in Vietnam in 2016 in our Crosstalk. During the past 5 years, merger and acquisition, or M&A, has played an important role in the process of restructuring the Vietnamese economy and helps attract more investment into the country. According to the Institute of Mergers, Acquisitions and Alliances in Switzerland, in 2016, the total value of M&A deals in Vietnam is forecasted to reach $6 billion, breaking the record of $5.2 billion in 2015. However, besides positive results, M&A activities in Vietnam are still facing some issues, such as the risks of losing well-established national brands or the lack of a consistent M&A framework. How to make M&A become an effective tool for the restructuring of the domestic economy and enterprises. How to use M&A for capital mobilization. What are the trends of M&A in 2016? These questions will be answered in our BizLine this week. Our guest is Dr. Christopher Kumar, President of the Institute of Mergers, Acquisitions and Alliances, or IMAA, based in Switzerland. But before we start our discussion, let's take a look at the following clip to understand more about the overview of the M&A activities in Vietnam during the past 1 year.
According to the report released at the Mergers and Acquisitions M&A Forum 2016, there were 345 M&A deals in Vietnam with a total value of $4 billion. This figure is higher than the total value of transactions in 2014 of $3 billion. In 2015, Vietnam had 531 M&A transactions with a total value of $5 billion. In 2016, the number of total transactions is forecasted to reach 600 deals with a total value of $6 billion. Foreign investors are responsible for the majority of high-value transactions. Among the 10 deals with the highest value so far, 9 deals have foreign investors as strategic buyers. The scale of these deals ranged from $30 to $100 million. The deal with the highest value reached $1.1 billion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher Kumar, for joining our BizLine program.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
What are the highlights of the event this year? What new trend do you see in the M&A sector in Vietnam?
I think in the long run, there will be more companies from the region expanding into Vietnam. I think there may be also lots of opportunities to Vietnamese companies expand abroad in the region. There have been already lots of foreign companies buy into Vietnam, mostly Asian companies. The second largest region expanding by M&A into Vietnam is Europe. And some acquisitions in manufacturing and also consumer goods. And so I guess from that point of view, they're not so different from Asian experience. We looked at measuring the success for Japanese, Korean and Western companies with regards to M&A in Vietnam, and actually the Western ones did the better deals in the country. So in 2016, at the moment, we really look at another record in mergers and acquisitions in Vietnam. So in terms of numbers of deals, but also in terms of value. So, and that's completely contrary to the worldwide trend. I mean, worldwide M&A this year is really decreasing in terms of numbers and value. The big deals we've seen in the US or any other things have not really been repeated this year so far.
What do you think about the deals that get awarded this year?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are sort of pretty new acquirers, internationally new acquirers. They're new to Vietnam. So I hope they will have a successful deal after closing the deal, really operating the companies. Because what many companies underestimate is doing M&A is not just negotiating, closing the deal, paying some money. I always say, like, everybody can buy. I mean, it's just a question of how much you can afford, and you will find something you can buy. But the question is, you have to actually manage these companies later and make them a success. And I mean, this is where a lot of efforts need to be taken, and that's what many people really underestimate.
As you have mentioned, there are a lot of interest from South Korea, Japan, or Singapore investors in M&A deals in Vietnam. So how can Vietnam balance the interests of those players and take the most advantage out of it?
Japanese companies and Korean companies have done lots of things in Vietnam in the past. I think the Thai acquirers are relatively newer to Vietnam than others, and they all look for the same. They look for, you know, growth outside their home markets, which have been either stagnant or very volatile. It's all across many industries, so it's retail, consumer goods, but also real estate. I mean, Japan has, until 4 or 5 years ago, also been very inward-looking, so they didn't do a lot of M&A. I would say after Fukushima, really, after the sort of catastrophe, there has been a tremendous push outside. I mean, pharmaceutical companies from Japan have done a lot of deals abroad, and so they're very actively screening opportunities, also insurance businesses, and I know there have been some investments here in Vietnam too in this sector. So that's where Japanese are very, very active now. The Singaporeans are still also very much inward looking, but, you know, have global investments too. And so balancing, I guess, like in M&A, it's a choice of the seller, right? I mean, who do you choose? And often people choose, of course, people that pay the highest price. And so the question is, like, who's willing to pay the highest price? And that's, of course, a little bit of a race or competition among potential bidders. And this is also why you see some Asian investors may come first, because some opportunities are just not known in the US or just not known in Europe. Because, of course, it's much harder to get the move because there's so many hours away, it's different languages and whatever. But it may be worthwhile the effort because, you know, some of them, if they do acquisitions, they're very reliable shareholders. They really have a very long-term view on building the companies too. But I guess, like, as a government, you hardly can make the choices, I guess. That's, you know, the companies that sell, that make these choices.
Among the most eager newcomers to Vietnam are Thai investors. At the end of 2015, Sincar Asia, a key subsidiary of Thailand's largest beer brand, forked over $1.1 billion to acquire stakes at Masan Consumer Holdings. This deal set the record as Vietnam's largest M&A ever, allowing the two partners to reach 250 million consumers in Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia and Laos. The second most talked about deal was Central Group and Nguyễn Kim buying out Big C Vietnam in a deal worth $1.05 billion in April 2016.
Japanese investors focus on buying stakes of Vietnamese state-owned enterprises in important industries. Japan's NNA Holdings has poured $109 million into buying 8.8% of Vietnam Airlines shares, becoming the first major overseas shareholder of the airline.
Meanwhile, Singaporean investors are keen on the real estate market in Vietnam. The hottest real estate M&A in the first quarter 2016 is between Singapore's Keppel Land and the developers of Empire City in Ho Chi Minh City's District 2. Keppel Land has laid out $93.9 million in exchange for 40% of the project stakes.
Retail, food production, and real estate are the three sectors where the majority of M&A activities are done. The retail sector topped the list with 30% of the total M&A transactions, followed by food production 28% and real estate 27%. These sectors are expected to continue to attract large foreign capital through M&A because this is the fastest way for foreign buyers to reach Vietnam's domestic market. So the race is on, and what should Vietnam do to avail of upcoming opportunities?
I think it depends on how a Vietnamese company looks at working together with a foreign partner. Is that really as just a cooperation partner, or is it selling a stake to this company? Most corporate strategic buyers want to buy rather the complete company. They're not interested in just buying minority stakes or significant stakes like maybe financial investors. I mean, you've had private equity funds, small funds do deals here, but you have also, of course, already large funds like KKR taking a stake in Masan and other things. So there's a large interest from strategic buyers, but also financial acquirers. I think as a Vietnamese company selling to those, you need to understand what is their interest. What do they really want? Is that the right partner for me? And therefore you need to understand what is it that the other side also tries to achieve.
So what are the challenges and opportunities for Vietnamese companies?
Some Vietnamese companies, it's of course difficult to understand how a foreign company looks at working with a Vietnamese company or acquiring a Vietnamese company. So doing the whole process from due diligence all the way through really negotiating the agreement and things, of course has challenges. I mean, that's all the same all around the world. If you've never done it before and you do it the first time, you of course experience a lot of challenges. The worst case scenario is if you do deals, you may actually buy companies and pay too much money for the companies. And of course, you know, this happens from time to time. It has happened in the past too. So that's of course one major challenge. The other challenge that often exists in M&A is antitrust, that companies grow to become too dominant by abusing mergers and acquisitions. But that's not the case here in the country so far or in the region. I mean, all ASEAN countries have set up antitrust commissions to try to avoid anything like this from happening. The other way around, I guess, you know, we've seen some few examples of Vietnamese companies starting to do acquisitions abroad. I think that's the very big thing that has not yet taken off really. But you can see that many companies from emerging and developing economies do acquisitions abroad as well. So Vietnamese companies can position as regional players in the very beginning, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, to quote some examples of countries.
From early 2016 to the present, the real estate market in Vietnam has witnessed many joint venture projects and large-scale M&A deals with the involvement of foreign partners. Singapore's Keppel Land recently bought a 40% stake of the Empire City project in District 2, Ho Chi Minh City. This $93.9 million deal made Keppel Land the largest shareholder of the project besides Tiến Phước, a real estate joint stock company, which owns 30% of shares of the project.
Real estate is a very quick and is probably one of the first movers in any economic upturn, and it's probably good to go in the first wave, yeah, and hence you see the likes of Keppel Land partnering with Tiến Phước, yeah. So these are the areas in which is attracting Singapore.
Cái quan sát của tôi trong thời gian gần đây á, thì những thương vụ M&A trong cái lĩnh vực bất động sản á, thì đa số là tập trung vào những cái bất động sản mà nguồn thu dài hạn, ví dụ văn phòng, khách sạn, trung tâm thương mại. Cũng có một vài những cái thương vụ M&A về những cái khu đất mà phát triển bất động sản, nhưng mà đa số thì vẫn là những cái loại hình bất động sản kia.
What are the advantages of Vietnam being a part of the AEC and joining other free trade agreements in terms of attracting M&A in Vietnam?
One thing that the free trade agreements do is, of course, improve the attractiveness of Vietnam as a manufacturing location, and therefore, of course, to serve as a hub to reach out to the region. So we have examples of European and of course many other companies that come here to manufacture. Often they rather set this up as a greenfield investment. They don't necessarily acquire a company to do so. While if you take a look at Vietnam as a market with large population, vibrant, interesting demography, there of course companies look more at doing acquisitions to benefit from an existing distribution network, maybe using also an existing brand, which you could see with King Do deals around this, people using the network and the brands to increase their sales network here in Vietnam. So I think it's two different ways, whether you look at Vietnam as a part of the supply chain, doing manufacturing, or as a place to actually achieve sales. From a supply chain point of view, you can see now the effect of it. That more and more people look at locating manufacturing here, and they do this of course not only by greenfield investment but also by acquiring companies, and so therefore by positioning Vietnam in this economic field in quite a good way, I think that's why it spurs more interest by foreign companies come to Vietnam.
Startups and entrepreneurship has been the buzzword of the first 9 months of 2016. The M&A Forum 2016 dedicated a segment for startups to showcase their idea and products. This has never been done before. According to statistics released by Topica Founder Institute, nearly half of the initial investment for Vietnamese startups come from foreign capital. The most impressive deal of 2015 belongs to Fossil and Misfit. Misfit, a Vietnam-based firm founded by international businessmen, has been acquired by Fossil for $260 million. Kids Online is a startup from Hanoi attending the M&A Forum. Kids Online is an application that helps teachers and parents of kindergarten students connect and exchange information. Participating in the event, Kids Online hopes to find investors for their idea.
Rất ít hoặc là chưa có các vụ mua bán sát nhập liên quan đến công nghệ. Thì năm nay có sự tham gia của các startup, thì là Kids Online là một startup về công nghệ. Thì là qua chương trình cũng rất muốn gửi thông điệp là sẽ thổi một luồng gió mới vào các vụ mua bán sát nhập trong thời gian tới tại Việt Nam.
Companies which are well established can and should mix and keep a pulse on the startup scene. Why? Because the startup scene is the future. The future innovations, the future technologies, edtech, medtech, and in the merger and acquisition industry, it's not a bad idea for, let's say, a newly acquired company to also take a look at competing markets or technologies so that they can make their new acquisition more robust or more competitive.
The startup trend is expected to create a new trend in M&A in Vietnam in the future, M&A in the technology sector.
It is also worth noting that there is a trend of international conglomerates taking over projects from investment funds. In fact, these investment funds, after a short while, would divest their investment to realize profit via the exit strategy by selling their stakes to foreign companies. With this tendency, the investment funds themselves are acting as intermediaries for M&A deals. One example is the case of Japanese company Taisho acquiring 24% stake of Haojiang Pharma Corporation via investment funds. Unitas Impact is a venture capital firm based in San Francisco, making investment in Southeast Asia worth of $45 million. The company is looking for investment opportunities and exits in Vietnam.
M&A is perhaps the number one way that we see a fund such as ourselves, an early stage fund, achieving an exit. So I think ultimately we hope that some of our portfolio companies will become attractive to strategic acquirers coming in either from Vietnam or across the region. So I think in that sense I'm very interested in the M&A market in Vietnam and looking at these potential options to potentially exit our stake in some of these companies.
So what are your recommendations for regulatory framework and policies to support Vietnamese businesses in welcoming new investment wave?
I think there's still some restrictions in terms of in which industries acquisitions can be done and foreign ownership is allowed. I guess over time this will become more relaxed. From the legal framework, it's interesting to see that apparently the legal framework here works different, so that there needs to be the law to allow certain things to be done, while in countries abroad you would rather say if there's no law against it, you would just do things. So therefore, of course, the regulator has to foresee and be maybe more forward-looking.
Is there any lesson learned that Vietnam can take from other countries in terms of M&A experience?
We compare the European integration and what has happened in terms of mergers and acquisitions there. Mergers and acquisitions has grown rapidly in Europe during the years of the economic integration of the countries there. What has primarily increased is cross-border M&A. So companies do buy into Europe, or European companies do acquisitions abroad. What has remained relatively stable in terms of percentages, the intra-European M&A deals. And so I would imagine that for any Asian economic integration, it may be relatively similar. So you will see, of course, more and more M&A happening here in the region, and the share of intra-Asian M&A happening will probably remain pretty stable, while the economic integration here will make the region more attractive for foreigners to do more M&A, but also I think it will strengthen the companies to look at really doing M&A abroad, outside of Asia as well. I know it's not a fairly popular example to use, but I mean, Chinese companies have done a lot of M&A abroad. They only try not only to secure resources, but also buy brands, technology, access to distribution. And you also saw a couple of Indian companies do M&A abroad as well. So I think from a financing point of view, it's a really plain level field. So also Vietnamese companies could actually do more M&A abroad.
Once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Vietnam's participation in the ASEAN Economic Community and the anticipation of the TPP are crucial drivers to accelerate the foreign capital inflow into Vietnam under M&A activities. M&A is an inevitable trend. However, Vietnam needs to establish a comprehensive legal framework for M&A that covers specific regulations on barriers on M&As, foreign ownership limit, taxes, transactions, and transparency. These efforts are to guarantee a healthy environment for M&A activities, which will lead to higher state budget and stronger domestic firms benefiting from the marriages with their foreign spouse. And that also wraps up this edition of BizLine. Thank you very much for watching. You can always rewatch our program at vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. From our team here in Hanoi, until next time.